Jane Eyre, an autobiography by Charlotte Brontë, a novel featuring a strong and complex female protagonist who navigates a challenging life with resilience and integrity. The novel revolutionized prose fiction, being the first to focus on the moral and spiritual development of its protagonist through an intimate first-person narrative, where actions and events are colored by a psychological intensity. The novel is a first-person narrative from the perspective of the title character. Its setting is somewhere in the north of England, late in the reign of George III, 1760–1820. It has 5 distinct stages: Jane's childhood at Gateshead Hall, where she is emotionally and physically abused by her aunt and cousins; her education at Lowood School, where she gains friends and role models but suffers privations and oppression; her time as governess at Thornfield Hall, where she falls in love with her mysterious employer, Edward Fairfax Rochester; her time in the Moire house, during which her earnest but cold clergyman cousin, St. John Rivers, proposes to her; and ultimately her reunion with, and marriage to, her beloved Rochester. Throughout these sections, it provides perspectives on a number of important social issues and ideas, many of which are critical of the status quo. In this classic book, reimagined, Jane Eyre is presented through the lens of Margaret Atwood, a renowned Canadian author, poet, literary critic, essayist, and environmental activist. Born on November 18, 1939, in Ottawa, Ontario, she is one of the most prominent and influential literary figures of contemporary literature. Atwood's work spans various genres, including fiction, poetry, and non-fiction, and she is particularly known for her feminist themes, speculative fiction, and keen social commentary. Margaret Atwood's body of work and her contributions to literature and society have cemented her status as a pivotal figure in modern literature, continuing to inspire and challenge readers worldwide. Please enjoy Part 1 of Jane Eyre, Reimagined.
Chapter 1. The Curtain of Red Moire. There was no escape from the indoors that day. We had trudged through the leafless shrubbery for an hour in the morning's dim light, but post-dinner, the reeds always dined unfashionably early unless society dictated otherwise. The sky had sombered. Winter had summoned its clouds, gravid and grey, shedding a relentless, piercing rain that made any notion of a further outdoor excursion laughably futile. I was secretly relieved. The prospect of long walks, especially under the brooding eye of a chilly afternoon, had never charmed me. The inevitable return home in the creeping twilight, with my extremities bitten by frost, and my spirit dampened by Bessie's sharp chastisements, was a ritual in misery. Add to this the discomforting reminder of my physical inferiority to the stately Eliza, the robust John, and the dainty Georgiana Reed. These 3 were now a picture of domestic bliss, huddled around the maternal throne in the drawing-room. Mrs. Reed, ensconced like a sultana on her sofa beside the hearth, her brood momentarily tranquil and docile around her, was the image of contentment. I, meanwhile, had been exiled from this warm tableau with a cool decree, until Bessie reported and Mrs. Reed observed that I had cultivated a disposition more becoming of a sociable and sprightly child. I was barred from their circle. "What has Bessie claimed I've done?" I ventured, unable to mask the sharpness in my tone. "Jane, I will not entertain a child who questions like a barrister," Mrs. Reed replied, her voice a smooth, cold marble. "Find a seat, and until you can sweeten your manner, I prefer your silence." Banished, I retreated to the breakfast room, sanctuary of the solitary and the bookish. There, a bookcase promised diversion. I selected a volume thick with illustrations, a small act of defiance against the day's gloom. Settling into the window seat, I drew the red moire curtains close, enshrining myself in a womb of velvet, a barrier twice over. The curtains blazed a fierce scarlet, cutting off the dreary world to my right. To my left, the clear window panes held back the day's melancholy, but not its visage. Periodically, I glanced over my book at the scene outside, a near view of relentless rain, punishing the stoic shrubs, and beyond, a vista of mist and cloud melding into a monochrome tapestry of desolation. I was thumbing through Bewick's History of British Birds, more enamoured with the engravings than the text. Yet, Even as a child, I couldn't dismiss entirely the narrative of remote, storm-lashed shores and the stoic creatures dwelling there. My mind, ever hungry for more than the confines of Gateshead could offer, feasted on images of stark, rocky outposts and the relentless sea swirling around them, each a stark contrast to the oppressive order of my current environs. The illustrations were more than mere images. They were windows to other existences. The lonely rock amidst tumultuous waves, the shipwrecked vessel on a forgotten shore, the spectral moon observing the wreckage of man, each a story potent with silent meaning, as rich and as haunting as any of Bessie's fireside tales. In that moment, Buick was my escape, my companion in solitude. Here, in my red-draped alcove, I was untouchable, sovereign of my own imagination. Yet this refuge was as fragile as it was sacred. The door soon creaked open. "Bo! Madam Mope!" John Reed's mocking call shattered my peace. Silence, then a fumbling. "Where the dickens is she?" His search was half-hearted. He lacked the cunning to uncover my hiding spot, but Eliza, ever perceptive, betrayed my sanctuary with a mere flick of her head towards the window seat. Forced into the open, my heart pounded not just with the dread of confrontation, but with the fury of being torn away from my imagined sanctuaries. "What do you want?" I asked, the words brittle with forced composure. "Say, what do you want, Master Reed?" he commanded, settling into his chair like a petty tyrant enthroned. John Reed, with his sallow complexion and bloated form, was more suited to a grotesque caricature than the role of lordling he fancied himself. He indulged in excess at the table, which lent him a bilious air and an unwholesome pallor. School would have done him good, less confection, more discipline. But Mrs. Reed, ever doting and blind to her son's faults, preferred to believe his ailments stemmed from scholarly exertions rather than gluttony. His disdain for me was as constant as the northern star, his torments as regular as clockwork. In those moments of his cruelty, no ally came forth. The servants remained silent, complicit, and Mrs. Reed turned a wilfully blind eye. Obedience was my expected role, so I approached, bracing for the inevitable cruelty. But as I stood there, subjected to his mocking and malice, a part of me rebelled. His impending strike was not just an act of personal malice, but a symbol of every unjust power exerted over the powerless. His blow came, swift and fierce. "That's for your impudence!" he sneered. I had never planned to retaliate, yet as I steadied myself against the door, something within me snapped, not just a thread of fear, but the bonds of my imposed subservience. "You are like a tyrant," I shot back, voice trembling with a mix of pain and a newfound, fierce defiance. The escalation was immediate, his rage palpable. As he lunged, the room spun into chaos, a maelstrom centered around our struggle. We were separated eventually, Mrs. Reed's voice cutting through the tumult, decreeing my confinement to the Red Room, a sentence delivered with the casual cruelty of an empress dispatching an undesirable to exile. Dragged away, my spirit did not quiet. If anything, it burned brighter, fueled by visions of distant, stormy shores, where not even the fiercest winds could quench the fire of a soul fighting for its very existence. Chapter 2. The Red Sanctum. The act of resistance was unfamiliar to me, as alien as the concept of warmth in this austere house. My rebellion, however, wasn't without its consequences, marking me in the eyes of Bessie and Miss Abbott as a child possessed of a dangerous willfulness. In the heat of defiance, I had transcended myself, propelled by a desperate resolve, akin to what the French might term being beside oneself, a fugitive from the oppressive normalcy that had thus far defined my existence. "Hold her arms, Miss Abbott. She's untamed, wild as a storm," Bessie declared, her voice strained with effort as she tried to subdue what she saw as a sudden and alarming ferocity in me. "For shame! To strike a young gentleman, your benefactor's own son, your so-called young master," Miss Abbott scolded, her words laden with a righteousness that felt like another layer of chains. "Master? How is he my master when I am no servant?" I retorted, the sharpness of my voice slicing through the room, a desperate clawing against the roles they forced upon me. "You are less than a servant. You do nothing for your keep here," Bessie snapped back, aiming to humble me with her words, to pin me beneath a yoke of eternal indebtedness. "Sit and stew over your wickedness," she commanded, as they pushed me onto a stool in the dreaded Red Room. My instinct was to rise, to reject this confinement with every fibre of my being, but their combined physical might subdued me. "If you won't sit still, we shall bind you," Bessie threatened, with Miss Abbott readying to strip her garters for the purpose. The humiliating prospect of being bound like some wild creature robbed me momentarily of my defiance. "No, don't!" I cried out, my voice cracking under the strain. "I will remain still." Assured by my submission, they withdrew, their silhouettes framed against the door, their expressions a mix of distrust and disbelief at my sudden capitulation. "She's never acted out before," Bessie whispered to Miss Abbott, bewildered by my eruption of spirit. "It was always in her, just beneath the surface," Miss Abbott replied knowingly, as if my outburst had confirmed some long-held suspicion of mine inherent deceitfulness. The door closed with a definitive click, the key turning in the lock with a chilling finality. I was left alone in the Red Room, a chamber seldom used, but laden with a history that pressed down upon its every surface. This room, grand and imposing, with its heavy mahogany furniture and deep red draperies that swallowed the light, held an air of stately desolation. It was a chamber out of time, reserved for the echoes of the past and the silent play of dust motes and shafts of light so rare they seemed mythical. The massive bed, with its canopy of red damask, stood like a sacrificial altar in the center of this temple of familial exclusion. The air was cold, the room's usual stillness amplified by my ragged breathing. The heavy drapes over the windows muted the outside world, turning the room into a cavern of shadows and whispered threats. This was the room where Mr. Reed had breathed his last, and it seemed to hold his spirit in a lingering embrace, a sanctum where the living seldom tread, reserved for the memories of the dead. Locked in this spectral chamber, where whispers of the past were almost audible, I felt the walls pressing in, speaking of duty and repression. The heavy red drapes were like the curtains of a stage on which I was forced to play a part scripted by others, a part ill-suited to my nature. As the room darkened toward twilight, the shadows deepened into spectres of fear, and the silence grew oppressive. I wondered why my existence was so contentious within this family. Was it merely because I could not reflect their values, because my spirit refused to be broken and molded to their desires? The weight of solitude pressed down on me, and the walls of the Red Room seemed to close in, whispering of despair and rejection. Yet, even as darkness enveloped me, a spark of rebellion flickered within. This oppressive atmosphere, rather than quelling my spirit, seemed only to forge it stronger, tempering the steel of my resolve in the fire of adversity. Locked away in the Red Room, the world narrowed to the confines of these walls, heavy with the past and the scent of mahogany. Here, in the heart of my exile, I found not peace, but a hardened resolve to one day claim a place in the world outside, a world beyond the oppressive confines of Gateshead and the stifling drapes of the Red Room. In this moment of solitude and reflection, the Red Room transformed from a place of punishment into a crucible for the forging of my identity, one that no amount of repression could diminish. Chapter 3. Echoes in the Nursery. I awoke ensnared by a phantom dread, a nightmarish grip that loosed only to reveal the world bathed in an ominous glow. A terrible red crisscrossed with black, like the sky envisioned in the fever dreams of some doomed artist. Voices hovered around me, hollow and distant, as if filtered through a storm or muffled by cascading water. My mind, clouded with terror and disorientation, struggled to anchor itself in reality. Gradually, gentle hands guided me, positioning me with a care unfamiliar yet soothing. As my head found rest against what seemed either pillow or arm, a semblance of peace seeped in, whispering calm into the chaos of my awakening. Minutes dripped by, each a slow tick towards clarity. Recognition dawned. I was ensconced in my own bed, the nursery's fire casting a menacing red that had painted my nightmare. Night had drawn its curtain tight, a lone candle flickering timidly on the table. Bessie loomed by the bed, her hands cradling a basin, while a figure, a gentleman, sat near, his presence a bastion against my lingering fears. Relief washed over me as I realized this man was an outsider, unchained from Gateshead's shadows, and not a puppet of Mrs. Reed's whims. Turning from Bessie, whose presence was now a lesser evil, I studied the gentleman. Recognition bloomed. It was Mr. Lloyd, the apothecary, occasionally summoned to tend to our more mundane maladies. "Well, who am I?" he inquired, his voice a soft challenge in the dim light. His name escaped my lips as I extended my hand, a gesture of gratitude amidst the remnants of terror. His smile, though faint, promised a reprieve from my afflictions. "We shall do very well by and by," he assured, easing me back into the pillows with a directive to Bessie to ensure my undisturbed rest. His departure drew a curtain of gloom back over the room, sinking my heart once again into an abyss of unspoken sadness. Bessie's voice, soft yet edged with routine care, broke through my fog. "Do you feel as if you should sleep, miss?" I clung to caution with my reply, fearing the rough edges of her usual demeanour. "I will try." Her inquiries about my need for sustenance were met with declines. My appetite had fled with the shadows of my mind. As she prepared to leave, noting the hour's late advance, I seized the moment to voice a gnawing question. "Bessie, what is the matter with me? Am I ill?" Her answer was dismissive, attributing my state to the emotional storm spent in the Red Room. Yet, as she retreated to the housemaid's quarters, her words to Sarah carried the true weight of her fears. They were not alone in dreading the spectre of death that seemed to hover close by. Their whispered speculations, a tapestry of village superstitions, reached my ears as I lay in the grip of a watchful darkness. Ghostly visitations, spectral hounds, and otherworldly knocks wove through their tales, each a stitch in the eerie quilt of Gateshead's nocturnal mysteries. The night stretched on, a bleak expanse of sleepless vigilance. No ailment of the body followed, yet my nerves trembled with the aftershocks of that evening's horrors. Mrs. Reed, unknowingly, had inflicted wounds deep within my psyche, mistaking my tormented outbursts for mere childish mischief. By noon the next day, I found myself cloaked in a shawl by the hearth, the physical frailty stark against the inner tumult of my thoughts. The Reed's absence, a temporary reprieve, did little to calm the storm within me. Bessie's rare kindnesses, her attempts to engage with me through toys and tales, failed to pierce the fog of my desolation. Even the presentation of a tart, laid upon a cherished plate of vibrant hues, failed to evoke the customary delight. The once bright colours now seemed dim, the joy they once sparked dulled and distant. Gulliver's Travels, too, lost its charm and wonder. The adventures of Lilliput and Brobdingnag twisted into dark corridors of my imagination, transforming familiar joys into grotesque fears. Bessie's singing, a soundtrack to my childhood, now carried a sombre note, each melody tinged with the hue of sadness, her words echoing the isolation and longing of the orphan child in her song. Her voice, a blend of comfort and sorrow, wrapped around me, a reminder of my own precarious perch in this world. As Mr. Lloyd returned, his surprise at finding me vertical was tinged with a clinical concern that quickly turned to a mild interrogation of my spirits. His questions, aimed at uncovering the roots of my distress, were met with hesitant truths. The stark realities of life at Gateshead, my isolation, the harsh treatment, and the spectral fears that haunted me. His suggestions hinted at possible escapes, a change of air and scene, perhaps even school. A concept so alien yet so full of potential liberation. His words planted seeds of hope, the possibility of a life beyond the oppressive walls of Gateshead, a life where I might find a voice, a place, a home. Yet, as the day closed and the carriage returned, bringing back the familiar weights of the Reed family, the brief flicker of hope dimmed. Discussions of my future, overheard snippets of conversations about school, were tainted with the same dismissiveness that coloured much of my existence at Gateshead. The echo of their voices, the planning of my future as if I were a problem to be solved, a burden to be offloaded, underscored the harsh reality of my situation. Gateshead was not merely a home, it was a battleground, where every small victory in finding my place in peace was hard won, each day a test of endurance and hope in the face of daunting odds. Chapter 4. The Caged Bird Sings. From my clandestine exchange with Mr. Lloyd and the furtive whispers between Bessie and Abbot, I gleaned a fragile thread of hope, delicate yet persistent, like a spider's web in the dawn. Change, that elusive spectre, seemed to hover on the horizon, teasing and tormenting my weary soul. I clung to this hope, a desperate lifeline in the silent abyss of my days. Yet, as time crawled forward, days dissolving into weeks, the promised change remained a cruel mirage. My health returned, but the world around me stayed suffocatingly static. Mrs. Reed's gaze, a blade of cold steel, sliced through me, more piercing and unyielding than ever before. She carved out an invisible chasm between her children and me, a chasm that echoed with my solitary footsteps. Eliza and Georgiana, as if choreographed by a master puppeteer, avoided me with studied precision. John, ever the tyrant, tried to subdue me with a sneer and a threat, but my defiance burned hotter than his malice. I lashed out, my knuckles connecting with his nose in a satisfying crunch. His retreat, a cacophony of curses, was a fleeting victory. "That nasty Jane Eyre," he howled, casting me as the villain in his mother's eyes. Mrs. Reed's response was swift and venomous. "Do not speak of her, John. She is beneath our notice. She and her kind have no place among us." From my perch above, I shouted with the reckless abandon of the condemned, "They are not fit to associate with me." Mrs. Reed, her bulk defying gravity, stormed up the stairs and hurled me into the nursery with a force that left me breathless. "What would Uncle Reed say to you if he were alive?" I demanded, my words spilling forth, untamed and unbidden. Her eyes, cold and calculating, flickered with an emotion I dared to name as fear. The winter months dragged on, a parade of bleak days and joyless nights. Gateshead Hall, in its festive garb, was a mocking theatre of revelry from which I was cruelly excluded. The music, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, all were distant, mocking echoes of a world that did not want me. My solace was the silent nursery, the cold embers of the hearth mirroring the desolation in my heart. Bessie's rare moments of kindness were fragile reprieves, shattered too often by her capricious moods. January's frost sealed the world in a crystalline embrace, each twig and leaf an icy testament to the stasis of my existence. Eliza, ever the miser, counted her hoarded pennies, while Georgiana adorned herself in the trappings of vanity. I, the unseen and unwanted, tended to my menial tasks, my spirit shrinking with each breath. The window, a portal to a world both near and infinitely distant, framed the arrival of a carriage. Its approach was mundane, yet it stirred a restlessness within me. Bessie's abrupt entrance shattered my reverie. "Miss Jane, you are wanted in the breakfast room." Her tone was brisk, her manner unyielding. I descended the stairs, each step an echo of my trepidation. The breakfast room door loomed before me, a barrier between my insignificance and the unknown. The handle turned, the door swung open, and I entered a tableau of dispassionate judgment. Mrs. Reed, her gaze as cold as the frost outside, introduced me to Mr. Brocklehurst, a man whose presence cast a shadow darker than the deepest night. His scrutiny was relentless, his questions barbed with judgment. "Jane Eyre, are you a good child?" The silence of my response spoke louder than any words. Mrs. Reed's condemnation fell like a hammer, branding me a deceitful wretch. The conversation that followed was a charade of moral righteousness, a ritual of condemnation dressed in the garb of piety. "Do you know where the wicked go after death?" Mr. Brocklehurst's voice was a sepulchral drone. "To hell," I replied, my voice a mere whisper in the face of his sanctimonious certainty. His doctrine of fear and punishment was a prison of the mind, a cage for the soul. Mrs. Reed's machinations sealed my fate. Lowood School, a crucible of humility and subjugation. "She shall be brought up to be useful and humble," Mrs. Reed decreed. My heart, already bruised, broke a little more. The promise of Lowood was a false hope, a mirage of escape that masked a deeper entrapment. As Mr. Brocklehurst departed, leaving behind a tract as insidious as his presence, Mrs. Reed and I were left alone. The silence was a palpable thing, thick with the weight of unspoken grievances. "I am not deceitful," I declared, my voice trembling yet resolute. "I declare I do not love you. I dislike you the worst of anybody in the world except John Reed." Each word was a shard of ice, piercing the facade of our twisted relationship. Mrs. Reed's response was a mask of indifference, her authority unchallenged. "Go out of the room, return to the nursery," she commanded, her voice a whip-crack in the still air. I obeyed, but not before tasting the bitter fruit of rebellion. The taste was both sweet and corrosive, a fleeting triumph that left me hollow. Outside, the world was a grey tableau, the sky heavy with unfallen snow. I wandered the grounds, my thoughts a tangle of anger and despair. "What shall I do? What shall I do?" I whispered to the uncaring landscape. Bessie's call was a lifeline, her presence a fragile beacon of normalcy. "You naughty little thing," she chided, her words a familiar refrain. But today they lacked their usual sting. My battle with Mrs. Reed had changed me, had unshackled a part of my soul. "Come, Bessie, don't scold," I said, my voice softer, my heart lighter. Bessie's promise of a small celebration was a balm to my wounded spirit. As I embraced her, the warmth of human connection thawed the chill within me. That evening, as we shared stories and songs, I glimpsed a fleeting vision of hope, a promise that even in the darkest of cages, the caged bird can still sing. Chapter 5. The Morning of Departure. The clock's chime was barely a whisper in the pre-dawn hush of January 19th, when Bessie's candle flickered to life, casting ghostly shadows on the walls of my narrow closet. I had been awake long before her arrival, the half-moon's waning light streaming through the small window near my crib, a silent witness to my solitary preparations. Today, I would leave Gateshead, whisked away by a coach that would pass the lodge gates at 6. In the stillness, Bessie lit a fire in the nursery and busied herself with my breakfast. Excitement gnawed at my appetite. Even the simplest spoonfuls of milk and bread felt like stones in my throat. Bessie's concern was palpable as she wrapped some biscuits in a paper and slipped them into my bag, a small gesture of care in a world of indifference. "Will you go in and bid Mrs. goodbye?" she asked as we passed Mrs. Reed's door. "No, Bessie," I replied, my voice steadied by the resolve that had taken root in the night. "She came to my crib last night and said I need not disturb her in the morning. She told me to remember she has always been my best friend." "What did you say, miss?" "Nothing," I said, turning my face to the wall, a silent declaration of defiance. "She has been my foe, not my friend." Bessie's disapproval hung in the air, but I stood by my words. "Goodbye to Gateshead," I cried as we stepped into the cold embrace of the early morning. The moon had set, and darkness wrapped the world in a shroud. Bessie's lantern cut through the gloom, its light dancing on the wet steps and sodden gravel. The chill gnawed at my bones, matching the icy dread that coiled within me. At the porter's lodge, a flicker of light signalled the beginning of another day. My trunk, a silent testament to my impending journey, stood ready. The distant roll of wheels grew louder, and soon the coach's lamps pierced the darkness. "Is she going by herself?" asked the porter's wife, her voice tinged with incredulity. "Yes," Bessie replied, her tone firm but uneasy. "And how far is it?" 50 miles. "What a long way. I wonder Mrs. Reed is not afraid to trust her so far alone." The coach drew up, imposing and impatient, with its 4 horses stamping in the cold. The guard and coachman urged haste, their voices brisk and businesslike. My trunk was hoisted up, and I was pried from Bessie's embrace, her kisses lingering like ghosts. "Take good care of her," she implored the guard. "Aye, aye," he replied, the door slamming shut on the familiar world. Thus I was torn from Gateshead, hurtling toward the unknown with a mixture of dread and reluctant anticipation. The journey was a blur of endless roads and fleeting towns, each mile a silent eulogy to the life I left behind. In one town, the coach stopped for a midday meal, but the inn's grandeur only heightened my sense of displacement. The guard's attempts to coax me into eating were futile. My appetite was lost in the vast, cold room, its chandeliers and musical gallery mocking my solitude. The spectre of kidnappers, fueled by Bessie's fireside tales, haunted my thoughts. When the guard returned, I was a small, scared creature clinging to the familiar discomfort of the coach's motion. As the afternoon wore on, the weather turned bleak and misty, a reflection of my growing sense of alienation. The landscape changed, great grey hills looming like silent sentinels. Night fell, bringing with it the eerie whispers of wind through the trees. Exhausted, I succumbed to sleep, only to be jolted awake by the cessation of motion. The coach door opened, revealing a servant's face, her expression as unreadable as the night. "Is there a little girl called Jane Eyre here?" she asked. I answered, my voice small and hesitant. I was lifted out, my trunk handed down, and the coach sped away, leaving me adrift in the rain and darkness. My new guide led me through a door into a house that seemed to stretch infinitely, its lights flickering like beacons in the gloom. Inside, the warmth of a fire greeted me, but the room's dim light cast long, unsettling shadows. The first to greet me was a tall lady, her dark eyes and pale forehead giving her an air of solemn authority. "The child is very young to be sent alone," she observed, placing a candle on the table. Her scrutiny was thorough, her questions relentless. I answered as best I could, feeling more like an exhibit than a person. She directed me to supper and bed, her touch on my shoulder a fleeting connection in an otherwise impersonal encounter. Led by Miss Miller, I navigated the labyrinthine passages of the building, emerging into a room teeming with girls. Their uniform dresses and hushed whispers spoke of a life regimented and subdued. I was directed to sit, observing the rituals and routines with a growing sense of detachment. The supper, a meagre offering of oaten cake and water, failed to quell my hunger. Prayers were recited, and we were sent to bed. The dormitory was a long, shadowy expanse, each bed a silent testament to the lives contained within. Miss Miller, my bedfellow for the night, helped me undress. Exhaustion claimed me, and I slept without dreams, only to be awakened by the howling wind and pelting rain. The next morning, the cold gnawed at my resolve as I dressed hurriedly, shivering in the pre-dawn chill. The day's routine began with prayers and the formation of classes, the droning recitation of scripture blending with the hum of discontent. Breakfast, a nauseating concoction of burnt porridge, elicited a chorus of disapproval. The teachers' faces mirrored our own disgust, their whispers of abominable stuff echoing our silent rebellion. Lessons resumed, the monotony broken only by the rare glimpse of Miss Temple, whose presence was a beacon of hope. Her announcement of an unscheduled lunch was met with surprised delight, a brief respite from our hunger. In the garden, surrounded by high walls and winter's desolation, I pondered my new reality. The institution, with its cold grey buildings and regimented life, was a prison dressed as a refuge. A girl reading on a stone bench caught my eye, her book a portal to another world. "Is your book interesting?" I asked, my voice tentative. She studied me before answering, and we fell into a conversation that revealed the harsh truths of our shared existence. We were charity children, orphans bound by the thin threads of benevolence and duty. As the day wore on, the bleakness of Lowood settled into my bones. The meals were meagre, the punishments harsh, and the routines unyielding. Yet, amidst the gloom, there were glimmers of kindness and camaraderie, small rebellions against the oppressive order. The first day at Lowood ended as it began, with prayers and the gnawing ache of hunger. As I lay in the cold, dark dormitory, I wondered if escape was ever truly possible, or if freedom was but a fleeting illusion, a dream that danced just beyond my grasp. Chapter 6. Frost and Fire. Dawn broke reluctantly on January 20th, as if even the sun recoiled from the chill. The rushlight's feeble glow was our only comfort in the frozen morning. The night's northeast wind had conspired with the darkness to transform the water in our pitchers into solid ice. This betrayal by the elements meant we skipped washing, a ritual both banal and essential in its small assertion of humanity. As the hour and a half of prayers and Bible reading dragged on, the cold seeped deeper into my bones. Each verse felt like a new layer of frost, each prayer a wind whistling through my soul's crevices. Breakfast brought a fleeting relief. The porridge, miraculously edible today, was a mere whisper of sustenance. I wished my portion doubled, the way one wishes for impossible things in the depths of winter. I was officially enrolled in the 4th class, no longer a spectator, but a participant in the relentless march of Lowood's routine. The lessons were long, a labyrinth of memorization that left me dazed and disoriented. By 3 o'clock, Miss Smith handed me a border of muslin to hem, a task designed to tether my wandering mind. The quiet was punctuated by Miss Scatcherd's sharp admonishments. "Burns," she snapped, "turn your toes out immediately." Helen Burns, my acquaintance from the veranda, bore the brunt of her ire with a stoic grace that both baffled and intrigued me. Helen's brilliance in English history was met not with praise, but with punishment. "You dirty, disagreeable girl," Miss Scatcherd spat, noticing her unwashed hands. Helen's silence was a testament to her endurance, her refusal to explain the frozen water a quiet rebellion. My attention drifted as Miss Smith asked about my past schooling and skills. By the time I returned to my seat, Helen was being flogged with a bundle of twigs, her neck bearing the red stripes of injustice. Not a tear fell. Her composure was a stark contrast to the quivering rage I felt. "Hardened girl," Miss Scatcherd declared, dismissing Helen with a cold efficiency. A single tear, quickly brushed away, was the only betrayal of her pain. The evening play hour was a rare respite, the fires burning brighter, the chaos of voices a welcome cacophony. The snow outside piled against the windows, a soft whisper compared to the moaning wind. The contrast between the warmth inside and the howling cold outside mirrored my internal struggle, a desire for chaos and an escape from it. Helen sat by the fire, absorbed in a book. "Is it still Rasselas?" I asked, seeking connection. "Yes," she replied, closing the book with a sense of finality. We spoke of our pasts, our hopes, our places in this cold, unyielding world. Helen's serenity in the face of Miss Scatcherd's cruelty perplexed me. "Cruel? Not at all," she insisted. "She dislikes my faults." I couldn't comprehend her acceptance. I would resist her. I would break the rod under her nose. Helen's philosophy of endurance and forgiveness was foreign to me. "The Bible bids us return good for evil," she said, her voice soft but firm. "It is weak and silly to say you cannot bear what it is your fate to be required to bear." "But it's disgraceful," I argued, "and you are such a great girl. I am far younger, and I could not bear it." Helen's response was a quiet strength that left me in awe. "It is better to endure patiently," she said, "than to commit a hasty action whose evil consequences will extend to all connected with you." Her wisdom was beyond my grasp, her forbearance a mystery. "Is Miss Temple as severe to you as Miss Scatcherd?" I asked, seeking a different perspective. "Miss Temple is full of goodness," Helen replied, a soft smile lighting her face. Her praise and expostulations are gentle and rational. Helen's faults, as she saw them, were a lack of order and attentiveness, a tendency to dream when she should be focused. "I fall into a sort of dream," she said. "Sometimes I think I am in Northumberland, hearing the bubbling of a brook." Helen's reflections on Charles of Wim, his integrity, and the tragedy of his reign revealed a depth of thought that left me silent. Her admiration for Miss Temple's lessons, her passive goodness in the face of kindness, contrasted sharply with my own rebellious nature. Helen's belief in a higher creed, a hope for a pure, enlightened future, was her shield against the world's injustices. "Life appears to me too short to be spent in nursing animosity," she said. Her words were a balm, a glimpse of serenity in a turbulent sea. Our conversation was interrupted by a monitor's harsh command. Helen sighed, her reverie shattered, and obeyed without complaint. Her quiet strength, her ability to endure, left me both humbled and inspired. In the cold, dark corridors of Lowood, Helen Burns was a beacon of quiet rebellion, a reminder that even in the bleakest winter, there is a flame that refuses to be extinguished. Chapter 7. The Winter of Discontent. My first quarter at Lowood felt like an eternity, and not one of those golden, mythic ages. It was an age of struggle, of bending to new rules and facing unwelcome tasks. The fear of failing, of not measuring up, gnawed at me more than the physical hardships, though those were no small trials either. January, February, and part of March were marked by deep snow and later by roads turned to rivers of mud. We were trapped within the garden walls, except for the obligatory treks to church. Inadequately clothed, we shivered in the biting cold. Snow slipped into our shoes and melted, numbing our feet and biting into our ungloved hands until chilblains bloomed like cruel roses. Each evening brought the torture of inflamed, swollen toes and the morning agony of forcing them back into stiff, unforgiving shoes. Food was scarce and unsatisfying. The hunger of growing children is a ferocious thing, and our rations barely kept us alive. The older girls, driven by their own ravenous needs, often coaxed or bullied the younger ones out of their portions. I remember many a time sharing my meagre bread, offering up half my coffee, swallowing the rest with tears born of hunger and frustration. Sundays were dreary, hollow days in that winter. The walk to Brocklebridge Church, 2 miles each way, left us numb and frozen. We arrived at church colder than when we set out, the service stretching interminably as we sat, bodies stiff and paralyzed by the chill. Lunch was a meagre ration of cold meat and bread, the same stingy portions as our everyday meals. Miss Temple was our beacon in these dark days. She moved among us with a lightness, a plaid cloak gathered against the wind, urging us to march on like stalwart soldiers. The other teachers, burdened by their own despair, rarely offered such encouragement. How we yearned for the warmth of the fire upon our return, but the little ones, myself included, were often denied even that small comfort. The older girls crowded the hearth, leaving us to huddle behind them, wrapping our starved arms in thin pinafores. Tea time brought a small solace, a double ration of bread with a precious smear of butter. It was a weekly treat, something to look forward to, a tiny rebellion against the constant deprivation. I would often save a piece for later, though I rarely got to eat it. The others always needed it more. Evenings were spent in repetitive recitations of the church catechism and chapters from St. Matthew, interspersed with a long sermon from Miss Miller, whose yawns spoke of her own weariness. Some girls, overcome by exhaustion, would fall from their seats, only to be propped up again, a grim parody of resilience. Mr. Brocklehurst's absence during my first month was a relief. His presence loomed like a dark cloud, a threat more oppressive than the cold. When he finally appeared, his tall, narrow figure striding into the room, the teachers and students rose as one. His voice, low and conspiratorial, whispered in Miss Temple's ear. I feared he was recounting Mrs. Reed's slanders, branding me forever as a troublemaker. He spoke of mundane matters, thread and needles, stockings and tuckers, but his words were laden with his self-righteousness. Miss Temple listened, her face a mask of calm, though her eyes betrayed her irritation. Then his gaze shifted, fixing on a girl with naturally curled red hair. His outrage was almost comical. "Julia 7, he barked. "Why does she have curls?" "Her hair curls naturally," Miss Temple replied, her voice like steel wrapped in velvet. "Naturally, but we are not to conform to nature. Cut it off," he commanded, his voice trembling with indignation. Miss Temple's lips twitched in a suppressed smile as she gave the order, and the girls turned their faces to the wall, their expressions hidden from his view. Mr. Brocklehurst's hypocrisy was laid bare when his family entered, adorned in the very luxuries he condemned. Velvet, silk, and fur contrasted starkly with his sermon on austerity. They took their seats, surveying us with the detached interest of spectators at a zoo. I had hoped to remain unnoticed, but my slate slipped from my grasp, crashing to the floor and drawing every eye. "A careless girl," Mr. Brocklehurst proclaimed. He summoned me forward, his voice a death knell. I stood on a high stool, my face burning under the scrutiny. "Ladies," he intoned, "this girl is a liar." He detailed my supposed misdeeds, his words a venomous fog. The Brocklehurst women feigned shock, dabbing at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Miss Temple's whispered reassurance, "Don't be afraid, Jane," was a dagger to my heart. I feared her seeing me as a hypocrite. Yet, as I stood there, a gaze met mine. Helen Burns, marked for punishment herself, smiled at me, a smile of true courage and intellect. It lifted me, steadied me. I stood tall, defying the shame. The ordeal ended with Mr. Brocklehurst's decree. Let her stand half an hour longer on that stool. The room blurred around me, but Helen's smile remained a beacon, a promise that even in the depths of winter, there is a spark of warmth and rebellion. Chapter 8. Shadows and Illuminations. By the time the half-hour ended, the clock struck 5. School was dismissed, and everyone retreated to the refectory for tea. With tentative steps, I descended from my pedestal of shame. The dusk had deepened, swallowing the room in shadow. I retreated to a corner, folding myself onto the cold floor. The spell that had sustained me dissolved, replaced by a wave of grief so overwhelming that I collapsed, face down. My tears watered the wooden boards beneath me. I had harboured such grand hopes for my time at Lowood, to make friends, earn respect, and win affection. That very morning, Miss Miller praised my progress. Miss Temple smiled her approval, promising to teach me French and drawing if I continued my improvement. I had been well received by my peers. Now, all felt lost, crushed beneath the weight of Mr. Brocklehurst's condemnation. Could I ever rise again? Never, I thought bitterly, and in my despair, I wished for death. My sobs echoed in the empty room, filling the void left by the departing students. Suddenly, I felt a presence and looked up. Helen Burns approached, her figure faintly illuminated by the dying embers. She brought a small offering of coffee and bread. "Come, eat something," she said softly. But I pushed it away, feeling that even a drop or a crumb would choke me in my current state. Helen watched me, her expression a mix of surprise and concern. She sat beside me, hugging her knees, her head resting upon them like a contemplative statue. "Why do you stay with a girl whom everyone believes to be a liar?" I asked, my voice thick with despair. "Everyone, Jane. Only 80 people have heard you called so, and the world contains hundreds of millions." "But what have I to do with millions? The 80 I know despise me." "Jane, you are mistaken. Probably not one in the school either despises or dislikes you. Many, I am sure, pity you much." "How can they pity me after what Mr. Brocklehurst has said?" "Mr. Brocklehurst is not a god, nor is he even a great and admired man. He is little liked here. He never took steps to make himself liked. Had he treated you as an especial favourite, you would have found enemies, declared or covert, all around you. As it is, the greater number would offer you sympathy if they dared. Teachers and pupils may look coldly on you for a day or two, but friendly feelings are concealed in their hearts, and if you persevere in doing well, these feelings will ere long appear so much the more evidently for their temporary suppression. Besides, Jane, she paused. Well, Helen? I asked, putting my hand into hers. She chafed my fingers gently to warm them and continued. If all the world hated you and believed you wicked, while your own conscience approved you and absolved you from guilt, you would not be without friends. No, I know I should think well of myself, but that is not enough. If others don't love me, I would rather die than live. I cannot bear to be solitary and hated, Helen. Look here, to gain some real affection from you, or Miss Temple, or any other whom I truly love, I would willingly submit to have the bone of my arm broken, or to let a bull toss me, or to stand behind a kicking horse and let it dash its hoof at my chest. Hush, Jane, you think too much of the love of human beings. You are too impulsive, too vehement. The sovereign hand that created your frame and put life into it has provided you with other resources than your feeble self, or than creatures as feeble as you. Besides this earth, and besides the race of men, there is an invisible world and a kingdom of spirits. That world is around us, for it is everywhere, and those spirits watch us, for they are commissioned to guard us. If we were dying in pain and shame, if scorn smote us on all sides and hatred crushed us, angels see our tortures, recognize our innocence, if innocent we be, as I know you are of this charge which Mr. Brocklehurst has weakly and pompously repeated at second hand from Mrs. Reed. And God waits only the separation of spirit from flesh to crown us with a full reward. Why, then, should we ever sink overwhelmed with distress when life is so soon over and death is so certain an entrance to happiness, to glory? I was silent. Helen had calmed me, but in the tranquillity she imparted, there was an alloy of inexpressible sadness. Her words were like a balm, yet I could not help but feel a shadow of impending sorrow. When she coughed, a short, sharp sound, my own grief was momentarily forgotten in concern for her. Resting my head on Helen's shoulder, I put my arms around her waist. She drew me close, and we sat in silence, a small island of solace in a sea of despair. It wasn't long before another figure entered the room. The clouds had cleared, allowing the moon to bathe us in its pale light. It was Miss Temple. I came on purpose to find you, Jane Eyre, she said. I want you in my room, and as Helen Burns is with you, she may come too. We followed her through a maze of corridors and up a staircase to her apartment, where a warm fire greeted us. The room was cheerful, a stark contrast to the cold, dark halls. Miss Temple told Helen to sit in a low armchair by the hearth and beckon me to her side. Is it all over? She asked, looking down at my face. Have you cried your grief away? I'm afraid I never shall do that. Why? Because I have been wrongly accused, and you, ma'am, and everybody else, will now think me wicked. We shall think you what you prove yourself to be, my child. Continue to act as a good girl, and you will satisfy us. Shall I, Miss Temple? You will, she said, passing her arm around me. And now tell me who is the lady whom Mr. Brocklehurst called your benefactress. Mrs. Reed, my uncle's wife. My uncle is dead, and he left me to her care. Did she not then adopt you of her own accord? No, ma'am. She was sorry to have to do it. But my uncle, as I have often heard the servants say, got her to promise before he died that she would always keep me. Well now, Jane, you know, or at least I will tell you, that when a criminal is accused, he is always allowed to speak in his own defence. You have been charged with falsehood. Defend yourself to me as well as you can. Say whatever your memory suggests is true, but add nothing and exaggerate nothing. I resolved, in the depth of my heart, to be most moderate, most correct. After reflecting for a few minutes, I told her all the story of my sad childhood. Exhausted by emotion, my language was more subdued than usual. Mindful of Helen's warnings against resentment, I infused less gall into my narrative. Thus restrained, it sounded more credible. As I went on, I felt Miss Temple believed me. In detailing the episode of the Red Room, my excitement broke through. Nothing could soften the agony of that memory. When I finished, Miss Temple regarded me silently for a few moments. "I know something of Mr. Lloyd," she said. "I shall write to him. If his reply agrees with your statement, you shall be publicly cleared from every imputation. To me, Jane, you are clear now." She kissed me, still keeping me at her side. I was content to stand there, deriving a child's pleasure from contemplating her face, her dress, her ornaments, her white forehead, her shining curls, and her beaming dark eyes. Then she turned to Helen Burns. "How are you tonight, Helen? Have you coughed much today?" "Not quite so much, I think, ma'am." "And the pain in your chest?" "It is a little better." Miss Temple got up, took Helen's hand and examined her pulse. She sighed softly as she returned to her seat. Then, with a cheerful tone, she said, "But you two are my visitors tonight. I must treat you as such." She rang a bell. "Barbara," she said to the servant who answered it, "I have not yet had tea. Bring the tray and place cups for these two young ladies." A tray was soon brought. The sight of the china cups and bright teapot, the fragrant steam of the tea, and the scent of the toast were delightful. However, there was only a small portion of toast. Miss Temple noticed this. "Barbara, can you not bring a little more bread and butter? There is not enough for 3. Barbara returned with a message from Mrs. Harden, the housekeeper, stating that the usual quantity had been sent. "Oh, very well," Miss Temple said. "We must make it do, Barbara, I suppose." Then, smiling, she added, "Fortunately, I have it in my power to supply deficiencies for this once." She invited us to the table, gave us each a cup of tea and a thin slice of toast, and then took a parcel from a drawer. Inside was a good-sized seed cake. "I meant to give each of you some of this to take with you," she said, "but as there is so little toast, you must have it now." We feasted as if on nectar and ambrosia. Miss Temple watched us with a smile of gratification as we satisfied our hunger. After tea, Miss Temple invited us to the fire. We sat on either side of her, and a conversation ensued between her and Helen, which I was privileged to hear. Miss Temple's serene demeanour and refined language inspired awe. Helen, however, was transformed. The meal, the warmth, and Miss Temple's kindness had awakened something within her. Her cheeks glowed, her eyes shone with an extraordinary light. She spoke with a fervent eloquence that seemed beyond her years. They spoke of distant nations, ancient times, and secrets of nature. They discussed books and authors with familiarity. My amazement grew when Miss Temple asked Helen if she sometimes recalled the Latin her father had taught her. Helen read and construed a page of Virgil, her voice resonating with authority. The bell announced bedtime. Miss Temple embraced us, saying, "God bless you, my children." She held Helen a little longer, her eyes following her to the door. In the bedroom, Miss Scatcherd was examining drawers. She greeted Helen with a reprimand for the disorderly state of her things, threatening to pin untidily folded articles to her shoulder the next day. "My things were indeed in shameful disorder," Helen murmured to me. "I intended to arrange them, but I forgot." The next morning, Miss Scatcherd wrote "slattern" on a piece of pasteboard and tied it around Helen's forehead. Helen wore it patiently, regarding it as deserved punishment. As soon as Miss Scatcherd left after afternoon school, I tore the sign off and thrust it into the fire. The fury that Helen could not express burned within me, and hot tears scalded my cheeks all day. A week later, Miss Temple received a reply from Mr. Lloyd corroborating my account. She assembled the school and announced my complete exoneration. Teachers shook my hand, and a murmur of pleasure ran through my companions. Relieved of my burden, I worked diligently, progressing quickly. In a few weeks, I was promoted to a higher class and began learning French and drawing. That night, I fell asleep envisioning my future accomplishments, dreaming of ideal drawings and the possibility of translating a French story. As Solomon said, "Better is a dinner of herbs where love is, than a stalled ox and hatred therewith." I would not have exchanged Lowood's hardships for Gateshead's luxuries.
This is the end of part 4 of Jane Eyre, reimagined in the style of best-selling romance author Margaret Atwood. If you're enjoying this audiobook, please take a moment to like and subscribe. If you have any ideas, comments, or suggestions about this audiobook, or if you have an idea of a classic book you would like to hear reimagined in the style of a modern author, let us know in the comments. You can hear the rest of this story by following along in the Jane Eyre playlist on the Classic Books Reimagined channel.